So we continue our study of the Gospel of John. Tonight, I believe we'll finish chapter 18.
今日は18章、ヨハネによるこの18章を終えたいと思っています。
Everybody who's here is a regular attender of the class, so I'll just leave this slide up for a second and remind us that we're studying one of the four Gospels, one of the 5 books written by John, and one of the many books which comprise our New Testament that were written originally in Greek and have since been translated into the languages that we read. The Gospel of John I've outlined this way, and I've had this outline up for a while. We've studied the prologue, where John reminds us that he who would become Jesus was with God in the beginning, followed by 11 and a half chapters of John's recollection of Jesus' public ministry, where he displayed great signs and taught important things, especially about himself. Followed in chapters 13 through 17 by some time that Jesus spent privately with those who had become his disciples and who would be the ones who would take his message forward into the world and from which the church would grow. And all of those important things now behind us, we're into the 4th section of the gospel as I've outlined it here, which I've titled the Trial, Death, Resurrection, chapters 18, 19, and 20. Jesus is now down to the difficult business that he came to earth to do. And some weeks in the future we'll finish in chapter 21 with the epilogue that recounts some resurrection appearances in Galilee. We are now in the trial, death, and resurrection section, finishing, as I said before, tonight, chapter 18. My review will focus then on chapter 18, which is the one that we're still in. And let me remind you that when Jesus finished that time together with his disciples with the long high priestly prayer, they then stood up and walked out into the darkness, and he had with him the 11 men who still remained as his disciples. And the place that they went to, John remembers, was a place they had often met before. Other gospel authors call it the Garden of Gethsemane. It was easy for Judas, who would betray Jesus, to find them there. He somehow managed to cause a group of Roman soldiers and temple guards and Roman and Jewish officials to grab up torches and weapons and lanterns and to go out looking for Jesus out on the mountainside. And although Jesus knew all the things that would happen to him, John says, when he encountered this big group of people that had come out to take him, he asked them twice who they were looking for, and twice they answered with great precision, Jesus of Nazareth, while Judas stood there silently, which I take to be significant because what it means to me anyway is that this large group of people who had come out looking to apprehend Jesus, they knew who they'd come out to apprehend. Judas might have engineered it somehow. We don't know the detail, but they knew that they were looking for Jesus. And considering the size of the group that they brought and the nature of the group with the lanterns and the weapons and where they went out to take him by night in an obscure location, and then finally how they reacted when Jesus identified himself when he said, I am he, by taking a step back and falling to the ground. We've seen here John showing us the great power that Jesus had and the great fear that even this large group of Roman soldiers and temple guards had as they went in search of him. In fact, it's almost as if they obeyed a command from Jesus when he said, who are you looking for? Jesus, I am he. He says, well, then leave these others alone. They didn't touch his disciples. His disciples went away free as a bird, but Jesus then allowed himself to be bound and taken and arrested. You remember Peter, in that circumstance, grabbed his sword and thought maybe now is the time to fight, to defend the Lord, and Jesus quickly explained to him that this wasn't the time for that. He had every intention of drinking this cup which the Father had given him, meaning, as Jesus has said so many times before now in John's recollection, he absolutely knows he's going to death on the cross to do the work that the Father has given him, and now the time is really at hand for that. So Jesus was bound, and we can only say willingly, since it's obvious that he had the power to resist had he wanted to. He's bound willingly and taken first to Annas, the father-in-law of the high priest. John is the only one who remembers that step in the sequence of the events. Caiaphas was the high priest then, and we learned earlier in John's Gospel that Caiaphas had already expressed publicly the idea that it would be better for Jesus to die than for the whole nation to be at risk, the wrath of the Roman Empire for the things that Jesus was doing. Jesus then there in Annas' place, and Peter and another disciple follow him. They're both able to enter the court of the high priest because the other disciple was known to the high priest, we're told. Again, this is a fact that only John remembers in all four of the Gospels. And in responding to the servant girl who was guarding the door and the other disciple had sent to get Peter and bring him into the temple, or into the court of the high priest, the girl said, "You aren't also a disciple of this Jesus, are you?" And Peter says, "No, I'm not." This is the first of 3 times that Peter would deny Jesus, something that all of the Gospels remember. Then Jesus is in before the high priest, which the way John has written it leads us to think it's probably Annas, the high priest and father of high priests, although it might be that somehow it's Caiaphas there questioning Jesus. I don't think it really matters in the end which of those views you favor. One of the things we see here, John remembering, is that in response to the questions of the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples, we were told, and about his teaching. Jesus didn't offer one word of sort of calculated defense of himself. Instead, what he said was he would stand by all of the things that he'd been saying publicly all these years. He says, I'm not doing anything in secret. I've been out there teaching openly in the world. He says, especially have I been teaching openly in the synagogues and in the temple places where Jews gather. And so Jesus is saying, why do you ask me? You already know the answer. You know what my teaching is. You know who my disciples are. And that was his way of responding. And when one of the officials, one of the temple guards, heard Jesus respond that way to the high priest, he struck Jesus, which was an unjustified action in this case, as Jesus pointed out to him. There may be a lesson here. People often take the lesson. Christians aren't always supposed to stand by when unjust things happen. We do have the teaching about turning the other cheek, but the Lord himself isn't beyond correcting somebody who's done something unjust in a courtroom setting here, as he had no reason to smack Jesus for that. When this questioning is finished, Jesus was sent bound to Caiaphas, we're told in verse 24 of chapter 18, and then Peter denied Jesus a second time, and again a third time, and immediately then the rooster crowed. That part in verses 25 through 27 of chapter 18. Thus fulfilling the words Jesus had spoken earlier to Peter when he told Peter that before the cock crows you'll deny me 3 times. And all 4 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, carefully remember Peter's 3-time denial of Jesus. It's obviously an important part of this story. That then is a review, quick review of the stuff we've studied before tonight, and tonight we'll read on into chapter 18. And if somebody could start by reading verse 28.
それから人々はイエスをあやかのところから官邸に連れて行った。時は夜明けであった。彼らは汚れを受けないで住み越しの食事ができるように官邸に入らなかった。そこでピラトは彼らのところに出てきて言った。あなた方はこの人に対してどんな訴えを起こすのか。彼らはピラトに答えて言った。もしこの人が悪事を働かなかったらあなたに引き渡すようなことはしなかったでしょう。そこでピラトは彼らに言った。あなた方は彼を引き取って自分たちの立法で裁くのよ。ユダヤ人らは彼に言った。私たちには人を死刑にする権限がありません。これはご自身がどんな死に方をしようとしているかを示すために言われたイエスの言葉が成就するためである。
ありがとうございました。And could somebody read English, please?
Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters, so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. So Pilate went outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered him, If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you. Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. The Jews said to him, It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken, to show by what kind of death he was going to die.
Thank you. All right, so verse 28 of chapter 18, the first verse of tonight's lesson, again, I'll read. Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. So shortly before, if you look back in verse 24, Jesus had been sent bound to Caiaphas, possibly even earlier than that, depending on how you understand the sequence of events between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In any case, all would agree that Jesus was finally sent bound to Caiaphas. And now we read in verse 28, he's being sent the next step. He's being led from the house of Caiaphas on to the headquarters of the Roman governor, whose name is Pilate. They led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. And you'll notice in John's gospel there's no explicit discussion of what happened before Caiaphas, unless you understand the questioning we studied last week to have been before. John now is just wanting to remember that the action moves to Pilate. And he wants to remember that this motion of Jesus from Caiaphas to Pilate's headquarters, to the governor's headquarters, was happening in the early morning. If you remember, Peter just denied Jesus for the third time. And the cock just crowed in verse 27, the verse before this. And cocks crow early in the morning. In fact, one of the Roman watches was called cock's crow. I think it was the watch just before 3 a.m. or something like that, when roosters normally start to crow. And that might have been what Jesus had in mind when he said before the cock crows. They crow all the time in a place where there are chickens around. And so we know by several reasons that it's early in the morning. We also know from secular history that Roman government business was typically transacted right after sunrise. If you think about it, you live in a world with no electricity and you have work to do. You don't waste the sunshine. You get yourself up and you get ready. And when the sun comes up, you start doing your business. And hopefully, if you're lucky, you've got all your business done in time for lunch and you don't have to do anything in the afternoon, which was sort of the life of a Roman governor if they ran things right. So,
I guess they didn't have any theorists back at that time.
Any what?
Theorists.
For what?
Oh, well, kind of humor, but it seems like experimentalists are people who get up at 5 a.m. in the morning and start work. Theorists drag themselves in late in the day.
Yeah, that's a fairly oblique reference. So we know that we're moving to the governor's place. We know we're moving in early morning. We know Peter has just denied Jesus for the third time. We know that it probably is the start of a business day as far as Pilate was concerned. Okay. And I'm thinking, although we know in John's gospel he tells us there were many Roman soldiers, and including the centurion who commanded them, were present when Jesus was first arrested, looking back to verse 12, the amazing, unique memory of John about that arrest time. I think now it would be fair to say that Jesus is mostly or even entirely in the custody of the chief priest and his servants and the temple guards, and not Roman soldiers. And the way that we can tell that is that the same they who led Jesus to the house of Caiaphas themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, so that they could eat the Passover, which is something that Roman soldiers wouldn't have cared anything about. Obviously, the group who now has Jesus cares about the finer points of ritual purity and observing the Passover and stuff like that.
Do you think maybe there's that reference in Paul about how Peter, when he was with Paul, he ate with the Gentiles, but as soon as
で
his
パウロ
brothers
が
came,
違法人として食事しますので、いや
he kind of separates himself from the rest of them. Is that
What is Peter?
The only thing that those two things have in common is the notion of ritual purity. So,
だから清めということですね。
a
清いことが
Jew,
汚れなのか、
and by the way, historians,
ユダヤ
including
の
Jewish
規範なの
historians,
です。
don't actually know precisely how Jews in the first century dealt with issues of ritual purity. You can read your Old Testament, what the laws Moses had, but there were a lot of laws and rules added by the Jews in the years that went by. And so how Jews in the first century actually sorted all this stuff out, we don't know. But they have this basic concept that you have to be pure in order to do certain things, and you can be defiled by, for example, the presence of yeast in your house, or contact with a Gentile, or contact with a woman who's menstruating, or they have elaborate set of rules, right? So that's the only connection, I think, with the story you're mentioning, is some people have that sensibility finely tuned, not to allow themselves to be defiled, like the ones that Peter would side with when they were in town, and other people don't.
だから他の人はそれほどでもない人もいたはずです。
Yeah, okay.
Sorry, maybe I'm missing your point.
No, maybe no relation there. It's just curious that they
まあちょっと興味深いので他の人と合わせて考え始めたんだけど、まあポイントではないと思います。
Yeah, so you can see that this group of people, they don't want to go into Pilate's house because they feel that will make it not possible for them to eat the Passover, because that will somehow defile them.
Yeah, I think the Old Testament law had one. Yeah, I guess they didn't really write anything specifically about entering a house, as I recall, but then they didn't, that contact with foreigners, I guess,
Maybe not, and like I said, thousands of years had gone by since the Old Testament was written, and so the Jews had a lot of time to accumulate a lot of extra rules about ritual purity, which is one of the things at issue, right? That the Jews have become so fastidious about stuff like that they've lost the plot, sort of, right? So these guys are having this problem, and I was just going to comment that it's extremely ironic that the people who are leading the Son of God, the King of the Jews, the Messiah of Israel, and conspiring to go have him killed by the Roman occupiers, are at the same time all worried about the microscopic elements of ritual purity law, right? You can see, as in a picture, that they really don't understand what's important. Right?
Yeah, that's true. I guess actually maybe what they're hitting is the irony of it all.
Well, that's what John is clearly asking you to notice. So John is saying, please notice that these guys who are going to kill the Lord are worried about defiling themselves so they can't observe the Passover. And what is the Passover to John? The crucifixion, right? That's the real Passover.
So the penny wise, pound foolish.
And John, who's writing at the end of the first century with decades of Christian reflection, sees it that way, and he expects a lot of his readers to see it that way also, right? That they had the Lord and they were fixing to kill him, and yet they were worried about not being able to participate in the Sabbath because they went into the Roman government, which is a very Jewish way to think, but not a very Christian way to think. So, verse 29 says, so, I mean, the Jews won't come to him, so Pilate will go outside to them. So Pilate went outside to them and said, what accusation do you bring against this man? Right, so there's a crowd of people early in the morning, and they've got Jesus bound, and they're leading him there to Pilate's place. They won't come inside, so Pilate comes outside. So clearly some message has gotten inside to Pilate to tell him that this man has been brought to him. And he knows that those who are bringing him are Jews, including high priests who refuse to enter the building because they have their religious reasons. And all of this must be the kind of stuff that Pilate, as a governor of Judea, would have been rather familiar with by this point. Dealing with Jews is something that he does every day. So I wanted to stop here and just suppose a couple things. I think these are legitimate inferences from everything that we've read. Pilate has known for some time, I guess, hours at least, possibly days, that Jews were conspiring to bring Jesus before him. Remember when they arrested Jesus, the Roman centurion in charge of the garrison there and a bunch of Roman soldiers were with them when they arrested Jesus. And for these and other reasons, I suppose Pilate knew that something was happening and Jesus was heading his way. And I suppose that Pilate had known something about this man, Jesus, for much longer than that. Months, maybe years. I mean, Jesus has been the focus of a great deal of attention throughout Pilate's territory during the 3.5 years that are just now ending. He's done miraculous signs. He's cleared the temple. He's done all these things. And these Jewish leaders are obviously really worked up about Jesus. And surely Pilate notices these things. Pilate doesn't have a reputation in history for being a particularly clever or a particularly nice man. But I think he would have been credited with enough intelligence to know that what Jesus was doing in his territory. And I wonder to what extent Pilate understood the charges that the Jews had against Jesus. What charges were they going to bring against Jesus when they brought Jesus to his headquarters in that morning? And I also wonder whether and to what extent Pilate and the people that hang around Pilate and Caiaphas and the people that hang around Caiaphas already had a deal in place, right? Or already understood that basically what was going on here is a conspiracy to kill Jesus. We live in the country of Nemowashi. In Japan, this would have all been decided ahead of time, right? And you would have just showed up for the meeting to make it happen. The more I read this, the more I think that there's a bit of collusion behind the scenes. People show up knowing some things before they get there, but I don't insist on it. It seems likely, though, that they would have.
But
Everything shouldn't be a total surprise to these people when they show up there at Caiaphas at Pilate's place early in the morning.
早い朝の時間にピラトの官邸に来て、そのことが行われようとしているわけです。
Well, maybe that's Herod, but isn't Pilate also Jewish? That they had a.
Pilate's not Jewish. Herod's
ピラ
Jewish.
トはユダヤ人ではないです。
Pilate was pure Roman.
ローマの役人というかローマのその役についている人です。
Okay, so you can just wonder, just be mindful of the fact Jesus has been out in the world for a long time doing a lot of things publicly. He's just emphasized that when he was questioned at Annas' place. I haven't done anything in secret. He's out there. The anger of the Jewish officials is nothing new. The relationship between the Romans and the Jews is ongoing at that level. Who knows what they were planning to do on that morning. So anyway, they wouldn't come inside Pilate's house. Pilate went outside to them, as we already read in verse 29, and he says to them, so what accusations do you bring against this man? Right? So whatever Pilate knew in advance, whatever had been arranged or conspired or guessed at, you can only wonder. Pilate does at least ask this question, what accusation do you bring against this man? You've taken him captive, you've bound his hands, you've led him before me, the Roman governor. You must have some reason for this. What's the charge against this man? Pilate asked. Which is a understandable question, reasonable question, right? And so in the next verse 30, they, that is this group of Jewish guys, probably chief priests and temple guards, they answer him and they say, if this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you. Okay, if this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you.
Until they're trying to get rid of him.
So if you look at what they say, their answer to Pilate's reasonable question, he's asked them to formulate an accusation. He may even already know that the end game is put Jesus to death. But he stands up in public and he says, please tell me, what is it that you accuse this guy of? And the Jewish captors seem at first unable or unwilling to even formulate an accusation. Isn't it odd?
Well,
to get up early in the morning and bring this guy and bring him before the Roman governor, and he says, what's the charge against him? And they don't have an answer.
well, it's usually when people are doing something wrong that they invent these kind of excuses like this. It's basically a kangaroo trial from the very beginning, so you can see right through the veil of that kind of kangaroo trial there.
That's true.
kangaroo trials in Japanese, but
Mark?
it's
Well,
just,
what's that, the kangaroo
I'm
trial?
trying to guess,
um,
if they want to be honest and say
Yeah.
what charge would they bring, they'd have to say, well, that he's claiming to be God, which Pilate probably doesn't acknowledge as being a God anyway. Or Rome wouldn't have, so he probably would dismiss that claim anyway.
ピラトはこのユダヤ人の人たちにその罪状を質問しますね。
So I'm asking this question generally. Why do you think the Jews had difficulty bringing an accusation against Jesus? Wayne's
で、イエス
started
の
by
罪
saying, well,
状が、まあ、訴え
they're
る
doing something wrong, and that's
ちょっ
the
と
kind
難
of
しいわけですね。
characteristic reaction of people who are doing something wrong. In other words, their response is sort of incoherent because they have a guilty conscience, maybe.
まあ、だから有罪
You're saying they aren't
と
sure how to accuse
そ
them
の証拠と
of something that
理由
would
があった
be
んでしょう。
understandable to the Roman
ローマの
mind
人
or
たち
legal
が理解で
system.
きる罪状であったかどうかということです。
インチキ
あ、
裁判。
カンガルー、
はい
ホワイト、じゃあ何？カンガルーホワイト。
Kangaroo court.
コール、オッケー。インチキ。
Yeah.
インチキ法って。
インチキ
うん、
裁
カン
判
ガルーが。インチキな法
Does anybody else have any ideas why they have so much trouble bringing a charge against
Thank
them?
you.
Yeah.
Because they don't have a legal one that will stick.
They don't have a legal charge that will stick?
No.
Okay.
And they know it.
そしてもうユダヤの人たち、ユダヤ人は知っているんですね。そういうなんていうか十字架にかけるちゃんとした理由が
Yeah.
きちっとしたものがないというこ
And how do you interpret the way they do answer? They say,
と。で、
well, if he wasn't doing evil, we wouldn't have brought him here.
で
Yeah.
だから悪いことしなければ連れては来ない。
What's that an appeal to?
ね、だからその中には
What-
訴
which
え
kind
が
of authority, though?
出てないですよね。
The kind that they have, which is what?
であるとしたらどういう訴えを持ってたんでしょうか、彼
Well,
らは。
that they just
They don't have any Roman authority, but they have a lot of some other kind of authority.
もう
well, okay,
もちろん
well,
ローマの権威とそれ
supposed
からユダヤ
biblical
人と慣
authority.
習があるわけです。
I don't quite.
I mean, he's the chief priest, and the people of the chief priest has all of the religious authority that there is in Judea, right?
Yeah.
That kind of authority they have. So if the Roman says, please tell me what charge you bring, and the guy with all of the religious authority says, well, I wouldn't have brought him here if he wasn't doing evil, it may be some kind of appeal to the religious authority that they do have, right? As if, Romans may not understand, but trust me, I'm the high priest, I'm telling you this guy is doing evil, right? So the other thing I thought of is, Jews probably didn't often take fellow Jews and deliver them over to the Roman legal system. So if I show up with a Jew and I turn him in, and they say, well, why are you bringing this man to me? I might say to you, well, look, I don't bring many Jews to you. But if I bring one, you can be sure that the guy's really doing evil.
Well, okay, but they would still follow up with what evil they did
Yep.
if
でも
it's
そ
a
れに対
genuine
して、
trial.
ローマの役人であるピラトは言いますね、その罪状を。
I'm just going to, I must be careful how I say it because this is so important in Scripture too, but I can see your very good observation that there may have been some kind of collusion here for theater on Pilate's part, but I really don't think so. I think this guy is looking for a way to get out of this. If there's any way he can get out of it, he would have gotten out of it. That's why I think it was more than just theater. When he said, if you have a problem with this guy and it's with your law and your faith, take him and judge him for yourself. I really think he wants to, I don't think he wants to have anything to do with this case.
Yeah,
And I don't think he wants, I think he is trying to, as we later see him do, wash his hands of the whole thing. Ceremonially, realistically, he didn't want to touch this. But they force it on him. When they say we have no law to put a man to death, only Roman law can do that, and trust me, this guy's bad news. He is forced to examine the situation. He is forced to make a stand, which he does not want to do.
Yeah, I wouldn't fight you hard on the point of there being any definite collusion ahead of time. I don't think he cares whether Jesus dies or not. But I think he'd be just as happy if the Jews would do it instead of him having to do it. But don't you get that sense?
Oh, I definitely get the sense he doesn't want anything to do with this case.
Yeah, but I hadn't thought about the collusion part.
Well, don't get hung up on that. So anyway, only thing I wanted to ask, and I think you guys have said most of the ones that there are that I can think of, is why did the Jews have difficulty bringing an accusation against Jesus? They show up with Jesus. Pilate says, "What accusation do you bring?" They don't give a very clear answer at first. And one of the possibilities might be that it's rather rare indeed for the high priest to bring anyone to the Romans to try, and so they may be saying, "Look, trust me. I tell you, I wouldn't bring this guy to you unless he was doing evil." And their sense of evil is sort of the Jewish sense of evil from the standpoint of their religious authority and their national authority. They're saying, "I'm bringing it to the Romans because he's really bad. Why are you asking me about that?" They could have had some kind of prearranged deal with Pilate, or they could have misunderstood and thought Pilate was just going to do their bidding, right? There'd been some talk, and they said, "We're going to bring Jesus over. We'd really rather have the Romans be the ones to put him to death." And they thought Pilate would just fall in line, but instead Pilate decided to ask them what their charge was, and they couldn't really answer that well. Or they said, "We wouldn't bring him to you unless he was doing evil." Maybe the kind of evil that they perceive Jesus doing is really hard to explain to Romans, like you guys have said before. They say, "Well, we know he's evil, but it's hard to explain to you," which is why they give him a fuzzy answer. Or maybe even...
I get more like, well, we know he's evil, and we'll find some way to make him evil.
The reason why they couldn't say that he's claiming to be God, and Rome would have rejected it if they didn't believe it. Because in the later verses, Pilate asked them, "Are you the king of the Jews?"
Not from Jesus, or he wouldn't have asked him, right? So he must have gotten it from them.
Political slant on it.
But the evil that Jesus does is even hard to explain to Jews. And so I find myself getting back to where Wayne started out, which would be to say, if you think that through this for a while, ultimately the reason why they're stuck, they come before Pilate, whatever happened before that we don't know, and they expect Pilate to take him and to put him to death, and that's finally what will happen. Pilate takes the step and says, "Well, tell me what the accusation is." And they say, "Well, if he wasn't evil, we wouldn't have brought him to you," which is really no answer at all. But the problem is, there's no good answer, right? There's no answer that makes sense under Roman law. There's no answer that makes sense under Jewish law either. There's no sense that makes sense under any law, because Jesus is the one guy in the history of the universe who was ever totally innocent, right? And so here they are, they want this guy dead and he's innocent, right? And so they're stuck, however you look at it, trying to figure out how would you answer the charge, what's the accusation, because there really isn't a good one that you can bring. So Pilate says to them, "Take him yourself and judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It's not lawful for us to put anyone to death." So my way of reading this is, not so far from yours, I guess, Steve, is that if he's asked the Jews, "What accusation do you bring?" And if the Jews can't even make a coherent accusation under Roman law, presumably because one has to be Jewish in order to understand the evil that Jesus is doing, right? That's the sort of nuance of what they say. I wouldn't bring him if he wasn't doing evil, but they can't explain it in Roman terms. Then if I was Pilate, I would say the same thing. Well, that being the case, if you can't answer my simple question, what do you accuse him of? Go try him under your Jewish law. Right? It's a good question. It's what anybody would do, I think. If they can't even articulate a charge, then Pilate should put the problem back to them and say, "You guys go try him under your law." And the Jewish answer is at least honest, right? They want to kill Jesus. They've wanted to kill Jesus for some time now. Several times John has informed us that they were seeking to arrest Jesus and to kill Jesus. And for whatever reason, they haven't been able to make it happen under the Jewish law. And so now their idea is, however you want to dress it up, is to push Jesus on the other side of the law, under Roman law, and let the Romans
それ
kill
は
him.
もうローマの法律があったらできるかもしれないと彼らは考える。
The more I think about it, it's even strange. They bring up what they want the sentence to be before they even come up with.
They've been very honest about this. I mean, John at least has been clear for a long time, many chapters, that the main thing that the chief priests wanted to do and the Pharisees wanted to do was to kill Jesus. Caiaphas said it'd be better for this nation if one man should die than that the whole nation should suffer because of Jesus. For whatever reasons they have, they want Jesus to die, and they don't really care whether it's legal or not, but they've got to make it happen somehow. It's very difficult to be certain why the Jews couldn't successfully try and execute Jesus for a capital crime under Jewish law. Some people say that after Judea became a Roman province, that the Roman government kept capital punishment as a right that it reserved for itself. And so even though the Jews could have tried Jesus and found him guilty of a capital crime, they wouldn't have had a right under Roman law to execute him. That's one thing that people say. And yet the Romans, we know from secular history, specifically excluded purely religious infractions. The Jews were allowed to execute people, even Roman citizens, who violated or desecrated the temple or blasphemed God. In Judea, strictly religious offenses could be punished by death. Witness Stephen in Acts chapter 7. He's before the Sanhedrin. They took him out and they stoned him to death. Right? The reason why was because he committed an infraction where capital punishment was sort of allowed by the Romans, right? And they did that. So a lot of people wonder why the Jews couldn't screw themselves up to charge Jesus with blasphemy or desecrating the temple, or it seems like they could have drummed up a charge like that and then stoned him to death. But they haven't been able to do that.
Could it be because they were trying to work, they knew that this was blood on their hands, and so they slip it around on the Romans' hands.
How
to say it, kind of like let's you and he fight kind of approach. So you get two people to fight by getting them by somehow playing against them. So in order to avoid, if you know something is wrong, and then you try to scheme some way to get somebody else to do the evil for you, you can say, oh, look, my hands are clean. See, they're clean.
Clearly. So I mean, the one thing that's clear is they want to kill Jesus. And it's easier for them if the Romans do it, for lots of reasons.
Yeah.
Because if the Romans take that responsibility, nobody will stop the Romans, right?
Yeah.
No sympathizers of Jesus are going to be able to do anything about it. They're not going to be accused of any wrongdoing, like you say. So the guys who want Jesus dead here are trying to make the Romans do it.
だからローマの人たちがそれをしてほしいと、そうしてさせるようにユダヤ人の人たちは尽力するわけです。
Have to go back, as you said before. All of this is taking place in the dark of night.
で夜の暗い中でほとんどの事柄が行われたわけです。
You got me there, since the Romans do that. But it was done with such secrecy. At the same time, yes, Judas got a bunch of people together, but it was a very select group that wanted the Lord executed. This looks like a group of people that really knew that what they were doing wasn't going to be popular with everybody.
Maybe.
And they didn't want an open discussion about this.
I think that's right, because you can't even make a charge against Jesus under Jewish law and have it not look stupid. Right? He didn't desecrate the temple. He didn't blaspheme. There's no way that you can convince a respectable room full of Pharisees that Jesus was guilty under the law, right? No matter who was looking, Romans or Jews. But there wasn't a really good case to be made against Jesus, right? The chief priests, for reasons known best to themselves, wanted him dead. And so they're trying, I think you're right, to get him over to the Romans and have him killed. The fact they went out at night and grabbed them is probably significant, because that minimizes the chance of Jesus picking up any allies along the way, right?
Yeah.
once the Romans have him, only God would be able to get him back again, right? I mean, because the Romans had enough power to kill him and keep the Jews at bay, I think. But back to your point, Wayne, I think you're basically right. They want the Romans to get the job done for them and spare them the difficulty of whatever it might be. And I was thinking back to your point, Steve, the Romans may have conversely wished to have the Jews execute Jesus for the opposite reason, right? Now you said Pilate might want to keep his hands off of that. And all else being equal, I think that must be true too. He's a politician. He doesn't care much about Jesus one way or the other, but he'd like to stay out of the mess. The only exception would be if he's afraid that if the Jews start fighting among themselves over Jesus, he's got insurrection and civil war, and they're not going to like that back in Rome. So at some point, it's probably expeditious for him to take Jesus over and kill him rather than let this mess continue, right? So we may see some of that going on here. In the end, he is finally persuaded to do the dirty deed, right, under his authority. All right. So anyway, think about all that stuff, but in the end, all we know is that the Romans would execute Jesus because that's what the Jewish leaders wanted. And all of this, we know, was in accordance with God's plan. Jesus knew it was coming, and it came in just this way. And John notices this in verse 32. He says, "This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die." And the one thing I can tell you is that the death of Christ by crucifixion would never have happened under Jewish law. The Romans were the only ones who crucified people. So the whole history of the church, looking back on the cross of Jesus Christ, has as its root here this little dance that's going on between the chief priests and Pilate that results in Jesus' death by crucifixion, rather than, for example, his death by stoning, in which case all of you would have to be wearing a stone around your neck rather than a cross. And all of the rich symbolism that infuses Jesus' death by crucifixion on the cross. The whole letter to the Hebrews, for example, you couldn't write if Jesus' life had not ended the way that it did. But instead ended this way. And as far as I know, most of the capital crimes in the first century were punished by stoning, like Stephen in Acts chapter 7. So I don't know how much of this messy conversation we've had is actually useful, except maybe to illustrate the fact that as much as we might want to speculate, there's a definite limit to how much we'll ever really know. But what we know is what finally happened was that Jesus was crucified by the Romans on the cross. And that his people, the Jews, of whom he was truly their king, are the ones who basically put him there, or put him in the position where that was inevitable. Where the Romans would really have no choice, as Steve said before, to do this wicked thing. Okay, let's read next 33 through 38. Please.
18章の33から38です。お願いします。
さて、ピラトはまた官邸に入り、イエスを呼び出していった。あなたはユダヤ人の王であるか。イエスは答えられた。あなたがそういうのは自分の考えからか、それとも他の人々が私のことをあなたにそう言ったのか。ピラトは答えた。私はユダヤ人なのか。あなたの同族や祭司長たちがあなたを私に引き渡したのだ。あなたは一体何をしたのか。イエスは答えられた。私は私の国はこの世のものではない。もし私の国がこの世のものであれば、私に従っている者たちは私をユダヤ人に渡さないように戦ったであろう。しかし事実、私の国はこの世のものではない。そこでピラトはイエスに言った。それではあなたは王なのだな。イエスは答えられた。あなたの言う通り、私は王である。私は真理について証しをするために生まれ、またそのためにこの世に来たのである。誰でも真理に く者は私の耳に声に耳を傾ける。ピラトはイエスに言った。真理とは何か。こう言って彼はまたユダヤ人のところに出て行き彼らに言った。私にはこの人に何の罪も見出せない。
ありがとうございます。
So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world." Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" After he had said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, "I find no guilt in him."
So verse 33 again says, so
32
Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" So the Jews have just made it plain, right? That what they want is Jesus dead, and they want Pilate to make it happen. Pilate said, "Why don't you try him under your laws?" And they said, "We don't have any laws that will let us put him to death." So that's what they want. So Pilate now, knowing what the Jews want, calls Jesus in to see what sort of basis there might be for this outcome that the Jews are asking for. And he begins by asking Jesus if Jesus is the king of the Jews. This is a description of Jesus, and perhaps a charge against Jesus that Pilate's heard from somewhere else, but not from Jesus. Otherwise he wouldn't be asking him. He's asking him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He didn't invent that expression. He's been provided that expression, probably by the high priest and others that set this up. If Jesus were to answer this question, yes, in the sense that Pilate is asking it, "Yes, I am the king of the Jews," then under the law at that time he would have been guilty of a capital crime. Claiming to be a king in a territory ruled by Rome would be enough for Pilate. Whether Pilate wanted to do it or not, he would have been able to come up with justification to put Jesus to death if Jesus simply said, "Yes, I am the king of the Jews." On the other hand, if Jesus were to answer no, right, in the sense that God himself understands the question, that we understand the question, then he would have been guilty of denying himself, much the same way Peter was guilty of denying him. You might tell Jesus is lying to save himself. He's lying to save his life by disclaiming, any kingship in Israel. So this is a tough question. And Jesus answers it in a strange way. He says, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" Okay. Now I think, if you think about this for a while, and I've thought about it more recently than I have done ever before, is Jesus is not being evasive. Okay. This is one of those questions that you simply cannot answer before you've defined the terms. The way the question has been put, it seems simple, but there is no yes or no answer, which is the truth. Right? Jesus has to shape the question before he can answer it. And so he needs to know in what sense Pilate is asking, right, before he could answer. Pilate's response then, though, is, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Right? So Pilate's resisting this point of clarification that Jesus is offering to make. He doesn't want to get sucked into what seems like some Jewish thing, some Jewish distinctions. some Jewish religious or political argument. He's not a Jew, right? He's a Roman governor of a province. The Jews have brought this guy into him and they want him dead, right? And Pilate has to figure out if there's any way he can put him to death or any way he can resist putting him to death and preserve order in Judea. And so Jesus helps him out here. And he takes a step in his direction and says, I can hear Jesus saying, look, my kingdom is not of this world. It's a this world kind of kingdom that the Pilate's asking about, right? And Jesus is saying, my kingdom's not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world. Right? So Jesus tells Pilate the truth, right? He's not trying to pull him into some religious or political argument that only Jews can understand. Jesus is saying, my kingdom is not even of this world. I'm from someplace outside this world. My kingdom is not of this world. And as proof that his kingdom is not of this world, that he's not guilty of being or trying to be the kind of king that Pilate is asking about in the search for a capital crime, Jesus observes that there's nobody in this world now fighting to protect me. You ask me if I'm a king. If I were a king, would I be here? If I were a king, would the Jews have taken me and delivered me so easily to you? Wouldn't there be people dead lying about? Wouldn't there be blood in the streets? He's no kind of king. And that's obvious from the fact that he has no servants in this world fighting for him. Verse 37, then Pilate said to him, so you are a king. Jesus answered, you say that I'm a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. So the way I hear this, Pilate's almost grasping at straws, right? He's trying to shape this. Do you claim to be king of the Jews? Are you king of the Jews charge? Which might be enough grounds for him to kill Jesus if he has to, if that's what it's going to take to keep Judea peaceful. And he hears Jesus use the word king, my kingdom is not of this world, and so he's sort of grasping at straws, and he notices Jesus has used this word, this word king to describe himself. And Jesus says, yeah, I use the word king because you did, right? You say I'm a king. But only to correct your understanding of the sense in which I'm using the word. Right? And now Jesus starts talking about something else. He says, I'm from another world. This is John's gospel to a T, right? Jesus began in the beginning with God. The reason why he was born, the reason why he came into the world. In fact, this is the only place in John where the birth of Jesus is mentioned, per se. There's no birth narrative in John, but here, now Jesus is speaking of his own birth. He's saying, the reason why I was born and the reason why I came into this world from that other place where my kingdom is, which is not of this world, is to bear witness to the truth. So the people who listen to my voice, and there are some, right? This isn't earthly kingdom stuff. It's the stuff of truth, right? I'm not a king that rules. I'm a king that bears witness to the truth. And Pilate says to him, what is truth? And after he says this, he goes back outside to the Jews and tells them, I find no guilt in him. I don't think Pilate has any idea here what Jesus is talking about. Whatever his responsibilities are as a Roman governor, figuring out what the truth is isn't one of them. That's something the philosophers do back in Rome, the Greeks do over in Athens, and people argue about the truth and stuff. But right now what he's trying to do is to figure out whether Jesus is guilty of anything for which he can be put to death. The one idea he has is maybe he's claiming to be the king of the Jews, and Jesus obviously isn't claiming that. He's claiming something completely different. He's saying, my kingdom's not of this world, nobody's here defending me. The only reason I came into this world is to bear witness to the truth. And Pilate says, okay. Anyway, you're not guilty of anything that I can charge you of. Steve?
Oh, I'm sorry. On the amen corner, that's correct.
So he's heard enough to know at this point that Jesus is not a king. That's obvious, right? No evidence Jesus is a king in the sense it means. Jesus is not claiming to be a king. He doesn't claim to be a king. Right? And whatever Jesus is claiming, although Pilate sort of doesn't understand it, right, and that makes sense that he wouldn't understand, is not something that you could easily use to base an accusation leading to capital punishment, leading to putting a man to death. And so for now at least, although maybe more than Steve, I would think that Pilate's not so stupid that when he woke up in the morning, his servants had already told him, they've got this guy Jesus and they're bringing him in and they want us to kill him. He got there and he went out and he says, okay, what's the accusation? But it wasn't clear at all what the accusation was. And so he says, why don't you guys try him? And they said, we can't kill him. Pilate tries the one thing he can think of. Maybe he's claiming to be a king in Judea, which would be against the law, but Jesus doesn't seem to be doing that. And so he goes then out to the people and he tells them, I find no guilt in him.
そして自分は最終的にピラトは罪を認めることはできないという結論に達するわけです。
Okay, 2 more verses to finish the chapter.
読んでくださいます。39と40最後までです。
住み越しの時には私があなた方のために一人の人を許してやるのはあなた方のしきたりになっている。ついてはあなた方はこのユダヤ人の人を許してもらいたいのか。すると彼らはまた叫んで、その人ではなくバラバと言った。このバラバは強盗であった。
After he said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, I find no guilt in him.
I think we're at verse 39.
Oh, 39. Oh, okay. But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? They cried out again, no, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber.
Okay, so these 2 little verses, this story about offering the release of a prisoner at Passover and the Jews preferring Barabbas are remembered by all 4 Gospels. So it must be important to the church to remember this. There's the only evidence we have of this custom of the Romans offering the release of prisoners at Passover is in the Bible itself, which is enough evidence. We don't have any more information about it. And I think that the important thing here is that the offer was made. Pilate's questioned Jesus. He may not understand him, but he knows that he's not easily chargeable with capital crime. And he offers the people a chance to take it back. Right? I'll just let him go. It's Passover, let's just let him go. Maybe that would even be a face-saving way to help the guys who brought him there bound in chains to let him go. Just, okay, it's Passover, let's let him go. But instead, they decided they want to receive Barabbas, who was a criminal, and most people think probably also a zealot, an insurrectionist, the person who sort of was plotting against the overthrow of Rome, which is ironically the kind of man Jesus is accused of being, and Barabbas actually was. And so they keep the innocent man. He's innocent under the laws of Israel. He's innocent under the laws of Rome. They keep him and they keep working on it. Finally, they're going to find a way to put him to death, but they let Barabbas go, who's a criminal and also a conspirator against Rome. Mark.
Another thing that's kind of ironic is tradition says that his first name was Jesus, Barabbas.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know how much you can trust tradition, but that's, and his name means something like son of the father or something like that.
Yeah, I forgot. There are 2 possible etymologies of Barabbas, and I've forgotten what they are. Son of. I forgot.
I think son of the father.
Son of the father. Yeah. What's the other one? I forget. Anyway, so we will continue next week reading of how Pilate screws himself up to finally wash
そ
his
して
hands
最
of
後
Jesus
に
and
ピ
allow him to be
ラトがどういうふうにこれを結論付けていくかということを来週学びます。
Did anybody have
準々章です
any question or?
で質問なりコメントがあったらおっしゃってください。
I really want to know about
で本当にこう知りたい質問なんですけど。
between the Jews and the Roman, who is really responsible for Jesus dying and crucified for them?
まあ十字架にかかろうとしているわけですね、イエス様が。
All of us.
Well, I think the answer has to be both or everyone. So, the Jews are especially in one sense, and that is, Jesus was a Jew, and he came to this earth as a Jew. So Jesus came first to the Jews. And so they were also the first to reject him, because he went there first. I don't think it was because they were Jewish, it's just because they happened to be first, right? But so does the rest of the world reject Jesus. And so the Jews are an example to us. I mean, the light of Jesus comes out of Israel, but also all of the bad examples for how the world rejects Jesus come out of Israel also. So here we have the same thing. I mean, the Jews are rejecting Jesus, and they're involving the Romans. And the Romans will be the ones who finally put him to death. So that finally everybody will be guilty of the death of Jesus, the Jews and the Gentiles. At least that's my thinking. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah, it's not, I always take that as each of us, in a way, puts him on the cross. And, or even if, and, you know, if we look at, if we really think about our own ways of things and, you know, try to put ourselves in that same place, we'd do just as much wrong as the people there. So,
yeah.
そこにいた人たちと自分を照らし合わせて考えることも必要と思います。
Our natural nature to sin.
自分たちだったら人間の罪という自然もともと持っている罪もありますね。
So is that a good enough answer for you? I think both the Jews and the Romans, and finally, as others have said, everyone is somehow guilty for the death of Christ.
It's nice always to think that maybe we could say, oh no, I wasn't part of that. I didn't do anything. But it just doesn't work that
Is that head person of the court? The pilot is. Who is the pilot in those days?
In Judea was a Roman province.
ユダヤの地域はローマの一つの植民地っていうか、そういうテリトリーの中に入ってた。
Pilate was a boss of that.
で、そのユダヤ地方の一番のボスが、ローマが支配してましたから、一番のボスがピラトです。日本語では総督って呼んでますね、ある訳では。
So he had a lot of.
必ずしも、he's not just the top of the court.
No, he had a lot of power. He had all of the power of the Roman Empire in Judea. So.
ローマ帝国に力を持って、その地方では一番の力を持っていた人です。支配者です。
And there's a lot of little stuff people argue about exactly what was his title. Was he procurator or was this that, the other thing? But it doesn't matter. He was the big boss of Rome and Judea. And I mean, one important point back to your point is he had way more than enough power to protect Jesus. I mean,
もうイエスを守るもちろん力も持っていたわけです。
all he had to do was just say, no, Jesus. He just said, I find nothing, what did he say?
ね、だからこう自分が力を
I find no guilt with this man. Well, you know, if he was a just ruler, then that would be the end of the story, right? He would protect Jesus
もうも
because
し
Jesus was
本
innocent.
当
But
にね、いい支配者だったんだったらイエス
That's why
が
I think
罪
when
が
he
ないってい
said
うんだからイエス
what is
を
truth
の
is
十字
kind
架を
of
回避
in
すること
a
はできたわけ
kind
で
of
す。
cynical way. Yeah.
very, yeah, he didn't wait and I don't know, it doesn't really say, but I get the sense that he didn't even wait for Jesus to respond to that question.
No, I think Calvin heard it that way too, like, oh, whatever, you know.
Yeah, well, that's-
Whatever.
The truth is whatever, what's true for you is true
Yeah.
for you, yeah.
Yeah. Or Jesus said, the ones who hear my voice, these are the ones who belong to the truth or something. And then he says, what is truth? So proving he's not one of the
で
ones
だ
who
から
hears
真
Jesus.
理とは何かというような質問の仕方もしてると
Boy,
思います
since I don't think we could say that Pilate was at all innocent. You weren't trying to say
だから
that
ピラ
before.
ト
But
が
he's,
あの
Far from
what he cares about is not having any political problems in his territory. So,
Yeah.
so he wants to keep business moving, and he
まあ
doesn't want word to get back to Rome that the Jews are fighting each other over some guy named Jesus, right? And so, whatever he has to do to keep things calm, he'll do.
まあ
He'll
自
do.
分
He
はそ
doesn't-
の自分が治めてるところを穏やかに治めたいと願っていたことでしょう。
Pragmatic kind of ruler.
He had a reputation for being mean-spirited and self-serving in secular history. He was he's just protecting his own rear end, you know.
Yeah.
Just as a further explanation and
まあ説明を加えると、
sort of like a period to what Greg just mentioned, administratively, Pilate's position was appointed by Caesar himself.
で、行
Pilate
政
was
的にはですよ、
directly
カイサ
responsible
ル
to
か
Caesar.
ら皇帝シーザーから任命された人なわけです。
This is part of the reason why he would be fidgeting in his sleep, if you will. If Caesar is unhappy with me, what will happen?
で、カイサルは、まあ、そこシーザーですけど、そういう地域のその上で
Yeah, you're right.
どういうことが行われているかをチェックするわけだから、あんまり悪い評判になりたくない
No,
ん
he
です。
was not.
だから穏やかに収めたいと思っていた。
Yeah, and I think the Jews were a difficult
で、ユダヤ人の
responsibility
群衆というのは
historically because
本当に難し
they
か
are
った
always
と思い
fighting
ます
about
ね
religious
収
stuff,
めるには。
which is why the Jews alone, I think, among the Roman provinces had the right to have their own religion. And as I said
で、
before,
ローマの
they could
そ
even
の
prosecute
なんか植
people
民
for
地みたいな
desecrating
中
the
に入ってる
temple
わ
and
けですから
blasphemy, even put people to death, even Roman citizens, if the person really blasphemed against the temple. So they had a lot of,
だけどそのローマに
religious
支配されてるんだけど自分たちの
and of course most of the problems are
あの
religious that came
守ってるわけですよね。
out of Israel. So I guess Pilate would be really carefully trying to
だか
prevent
らユダの
religious
ピラト
wars,
は
you
ユ
know,
ダヤ人を
growing
治め
up.
る
And
の
Jesus
に
was at the
よっ
middle
ぽど
of
気を使って
some
治め
kind
た
of
い
religious
そう
something,
いう
right?
状
And
況なん
he
です
wanted to make it go away probably as much as possible.
まあできる限りよくやりたいと思っていた。
Okay. Let's pray.
じゃあ終わりにします。お祈りします。
Dear God, thank you for being the kind of God that you are. We thank you for all of the wonderful things that you've created and done. And we thank you for the great mystery of how you created men and saved us from our sin through Jesus on the cross. It's the greatest, most important mystery that there is. And we struggle as we read in the Bible, Lord, to understand a little bit of your glory that's reflected there, knowing that we miss a lot of it, and not meaning to be in any way disrespectful or to making light of these most important things. We pray that you'll help us to understand you. We understand that the way you want to be understood is through Jesus on the cross, and we hope we can understand that better and better, including the stuff that we studied tonight. Please help us to work that into our understanding and the things that we'll read and study next week. We ask you please to be with Insuk and other people who wanted to be here tonight but who were prevented by their work or their travel or by sickness or some other reason. And we ask your blessing on all of them and also on each person here, and that you'll help people get home safely tonight. And finally, as always, we ask your blessing on the church here where we meet and on all the people who worship here and who do ministry here. We hope that the things that happen here will be pleasing in your sight. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.